Well, hello and welcome to the Managing Behaviour for Learning MOOC first question and answer session with Becca Knowles, who's Head of Network at the National STEM Centre, who's here to answer our questions today, which we've really enjoyed reading, haven't we?
Yes, we have, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here and looking forward to this question and answer session with you all. We've had some really fantastic questions that I hope we'll be able to promote some learning within the groups and some discussion. So Jane, off we go.
Okay, well, what we've been doing is looking to see which were the questions that were liked by most people, which obviously were situations which chimed with lots of people. And the first one that we've come up is Lee, who actually had 11 people would like this question asked. And she's identified that some students act out and their bad behaviour is a way of masking their lack of confidence and their lack of belief that they can actually do the work. What she's actually written is, what strategies can be used to encourage pupils that believe themselves to be incapable of learning and act out to distract from this?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because really I think it is that idea about self-esteem, and these young people are quite verbal about it. I think as a science teacher myself, it's always seen as being the hard subject.
Yes.
And I can't do this because it's too hard for me. There's some really interesting research around that is the Aspires project, and this is run by King's College London, and it's about thinking about science or a subject being for them. And I think it's really important that to have a look at that research and see, what do young people think about themselves as scientists, and how can we make them see science to be for them. And linked to that, I think, is some of the work around growth mindsets with Carol Dweck. I think we talk about this in many of the MOOCs that we have online here, but really it's about developing that resilience and remaining really positive with those young people, finding things within their own lives that they can connect with and supporting that to connect with them in the classroom, in the subject that they're doing. But it's mainly about being really positive, finding positive things and emerging those in the class.
Yeah, I think that's all lovely stuff, and that making science really relevant to children.
Yeah.
So that they can see why they want to do it and begin to feel more confident.
And I think as well that beyond science into other STEM subjects, it's about that contextualisation, and I think that we need to try and grab their interests and support them in, yes, this is something that I can do, and remain really positive and focus on the things that they can do, and share those with the rest of the class. Of course you can do that.
Yes.
Of course you can look at the bond equations in science.
I think what you say about Carol Dweck is so pertinent, because so often you have to admit, no, it is hard. I found it hard as well. You can't do it yet. It's
absolutely,
and
developing
or next week.
And developing that resilience is really important, and actually it takes hard work. A footballer will not become an expert footballer unless they've practiced an awful lot.
Yes.
And so we sometimes have to practice that as well. So I think that's really, it's about remaining positive, it's about trying to contextualise the learning, and it's about developing that growth mindsets in those young people.
Yes.
So should we move on to the second
let's
question?
have a look. Well, then the next set of questions actually are linked.
Yeah, I think they are.
So if I can actually move them on, that would help. Yes, so Suzanne asks about students who this time they still have that lack of confidence, but instead of exhibiting poor and challenging behaviour as a result, they do their very best to just melt into the background and keep their head below the radar. And Anita's asked a similar question too. And Susan's written, as a student, I had behavioural issues, but not the extrovert type. I was introvert, not social, so I'd not volunteer, question, speak out or take part. How do we address the issues of the introvert student that does not draw attention to the fact that he has problems and is very controlled on the surface? The behaviour is more hidden, but nevertheless is still smouldering just beneath the surface. I underachieved and failed on purpose. No emotion, but plenty of underlying issues. Not all show they're upset by shouting or throwing, especially if they are wary of confrontations. How do we help this type of student who is ignored because they seem to behave? It's a brilliant question.
It is a really fantastic question, good, and got 10 likes. And I think that this is really about self-esteem again, but rather this open and verbal, I can't do this, it's really sort of inward focused. And I think as a teacher, I think it's very important that you recognise those students in the classroom. I know that I, as a teacher, really aimed to speak to every child at some point in the lesson, either on entry, during, or an exit of the lesson. And I sort of felt that I might have failed a bit, really, if I didn't speak to all of the individuals and think about what's something to connect with them as an individual. So it's understanding that those young people are not so forward-coming, and putting in place the opportunities for them, you as the teacher, you as the adult in the room, to provide those connections. And again, I would refer back to that work of Carol Dweck, yes, around resilience. But really, as a teacher, it's about you to develop that relationship with those young people. And I think that one strategy that I used that was very positive was to actually indicate to the more quiet students before you exposed them. So if you're working in class in group work or practical work, that you would suggest to them that they had really fantastic ideas and you'd really like them to share those with the rest of the class before you actually exposed them to that. And I think that giving them the opportunity to say, oh, I'm not sure, miss, is a good opportunity for you to say, but yes, you've got some great ideas, please share them with everybody else. If you're not going to share them with the whole class, why don't you share them with the next group? So I think really around these more introverted young people, it's about trying to find that connection, as it is with the more extrovert young people, trying to find that connection, developing that relationship, but not exposing them too much in the classroom. I don't know what you think about that.
I think you make some excellent points. I think that point where you actually make that connection with those students and talk to them and try and make sure you've spoken to them in every lesson, because I think an awful lot of these students, and I think this is what Suzanne's hinting at, teachers don't even know they've got these children in their class. They think they're making good progress, especially if these teachers are stretched and busy. Aren't they happy with that student? And I've even known students in that situation come away with awards and cups, and because as far as the teacher's concerned, they're exemplary. The fact that they're not making progress, sticking their neck out and taking any risks, they don't notice that because they've got so much else on their plate. So I really like that, and I really like that you've drawn on the work of Dweck again, and having the belief in yourself that you can draw these students out, and knowing that.
Yeah. And I think it is really important that as an individual teacher that you realise that you can make a difference to all of those young people. I think that this is some of the, as we go through these questions, this will come out again and again, you know. Yes. So I wanted to raise that early on, and then we'll probably come back to this in later questions.
Yes, I like that as well. You said about giving them that warning before you put them on the spot. And I was just thinking about ourselves today. We haven't just been told, okay, you're going to answer some questions now. We've had some warning, haven't we? Can you imagine how we'd have felt if we hadn't? So I think it's a really good point not to just expect them to be able to stand
Perform.
up on top, pontificate without any warning. So
absolutely. Okay.
So moving on.
Question 3.
Yes. So this time we've linked several questions with 2 linked issues, and this time we've got the lack of engagement and also that low-level disruption, which are often linked. So you know, why aren't those children engaging with our lessons? And I can't remember quite who wrote about, you know, they've worked really hard to make a lovely lesson, and yet the children won't engage with it, and then you get that constant, very low-level disruption. So Sam wrote, my question is how to motivate the unmotivated students. I had few students that had no interest in learning, and education meant nothing to them. I'd like to learn how to motivate this type of student. And Anne writes, how do you stop chats unrelated to the work, students playing and verbal ping pong, but when challenged on this respond, but miss, I'm doing the work. And finally, Agnes writes, how do you stop constant low-level disruption?
Okay, so I think this is really interesting for me within the science classroom, because actually sometimes when they're doing practical work you want them to have a discussion and focus and chat, and whether that chat is about how to work better as a team, to get the practical work done, might seem off-task behaviour, but we don't necessarily always want young people to be sitting in silence working. And actually I think that developing focus chats is really important in the classroom. I think it depends on when the low-level disruption is happening and how you plan for that. So if it's a situation where at the beginning of the lesson it's coming into the classroom and it is you can't get the learning started quickly, then I think you need to really plan in some a hook activity that they will be able to get on with straight away, so that it gives you the time to come into the classroom and settle the class and get yourself going. So it might be worthwhile planning the use of other adults in the classroom to support you with that. But I think that if you have a consistent approach across the start time of the lesson, if this is the issue, then that will have a really good opportunity to get into some good routines. So have some routines for different parts of the lesson where low-level disruption can interrupt the learning. I think that, again, this idea around engagement really draws on the work of this science capital in about contextualising the learning that's happening in the classroom to something that the young people care about, that's in their local area, that's something that matters to them or their families or the wider world that they live in. And I think that that will promote the engagement that sometimes is lacking if they are or don't seem very motivated. So I think to summarise there, I think it would really be around planning activities and engagement at those crucial times, planning for those down times so that you can actually then re-motivate those students, having consistent routines. And I'm thinking particularly for me around lab work, it's that low-level disruption when they're tidying up, or when they're after a practical work, or when they're coming back to the end of the lesson to share their learning, that actually if you have a consistent routine around that beginning, middle, end part of the session, that you can sort of minimise this off-task behaviour. But also using the contextualisation of the learning to really try and hook those young people and engage them in that sort of activity.
Yeah, I'd like to pick on a couple of things there. First of all, I really like you talked about that we can't expect the children to sit in straight lines, and I think you make a really good point that it's very easy to have unreasonable expectations of what we expect of children. And I know now that I work with adults, after a career working with children, you suddenly realise that perhaps you actually expected more of the children than you would ever expect of the adults. And if you can't expect it of adults, how could I expect the children to sit there still with their arms folded, gazing lovingly into my face as I spouted wisdom? And perhaps there is, especially if you feel a little bit insecure, you just want everyone there looking at you. And an educational psychologist once came to our school and made a really good point and said the behaviour you focus most on is the behaviour you'll see most of, and it's very easy to focus on some of that low level stuff which actually perhaps doesn't matter that much. Now I would just like to challenge you just to speak a little bit more about science capital, because I should imagine that quite a lot of our listeners will not have come across that concept.
Yes, and that concept is really the idea of young people not seeing themselves in those roles as scientists of the future, and also not seeing themselves as it being too hard for them, or science isn't for me, it's not for people like me, I'm not clever enough, or I'm not in that sort of mould of a scientist. And it's about raising the profile of other scientists that are not necessarily the white-haired man with glasses in a white coat, but about contextualising the young female engineers, or interestingly male midwives, because quite often girls will see themselves as healthcare professionals, but they won't necessarily see themselves as IT consultants or tech consultants. And so it's about being able to raise those in the safe environment of the classroom and talk about those at that point. I also think that when we're talking about low-level disruption and lack of engagement, that we ought to be focused on, and you really brought to my attention, we should be focused on those children that are young people that are doing the right things. And so quite often we can distract other students from their low-level distraction by praising those who are doing the right thing and recognising those. And I think we talk quite a lot about that in the Behaviour for Learning MOOC in coming up weeks, and that might give you some strategies around that.
Yes, it's funny, when I was before I was a teacher, I was a lab technician at a secondary school, and I can remember one particular boy who was always, we were very, very aware of him. You know, he'd use the staff lift and just do little things that were not that bad, but he was very known without ever doing anything too terrible. But when he left us, he went to work for a local firm of builders, and lo and behold, that firm of builders came to build our new physics laboratories. And I can remember the first time I actually had anything to do with him in his new role, I went over and he was working alongside the foreman, and I asked a question which I thought I needed to address to the foreman. It was obviously something he'd been in charge of, and he turned to me and he answered the question so well, and I just thought, what were we doing to you all these years? Because he was so responsible. You know, he really did the company proud, did the school proud, actually. You know, they probably thought, what a good job we'd done. And I just thought, once he was given responsibility, he rose to the occasion.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when we'd marked his card, he rose to that occasion too.
Absolutely.
So I learned a huge lesson from that young man. So if we'll go on to the next question. So this is one where we've got a couple of teachers who are really concerned about the time that dealing with poor behaviour can take away from lessons when they already feel very stretched for time. And Annie actually points out that sometimes she just ignores poor behaviour because she doesn't feel she's got time to deal with it. And what she actually writes is, how do I deal with my concern over missed work time due to poor behaviour? I'm so worried, and I think that's so worried. You can really feel that there. We feel for you, Annie, about the time the class potentially loses due to misbehaviour, that at times I catch myself ignoring their chatting and trying to teach or talk over background conversations. And Anita writes, how do we deal with students darting out of class, throwing tantrums, just not ready to listen and not ready to come back, thereby causing time and energy wastage?
Yeah, I think that this is a really important point, that this idea about wasting time on behaviour management. And I think that you can't afford not to waste time on behaviour management and developing the routines of the class. And I think to a certain extent we're at this time of year where we've got the joy of coming up, the new timetables and the new year, that we have a fresh sheet every year, that we can start to develop our strategies with a whole new bunch of young people to enthuse and engage. And I think that it's really important to devote that time to those routines and allow those to develop. And I think there's a really clear opportunity to use scripts within that and to really try to be consistent and follow up poor behaviour and spend the time doing that. I think when I started teaching in every September, I would probably spend about 3 or 4 weeks at the beginning of the year really focused on the behaviour and the learning and the routines within the classroom. And you know, within a science lab, you've got to have a certain place for your bag and a certain place for your coat, and you sit at a certain place in the classroom, and reinforcing those routines over a consistent period of time. It was quite funny that one year that I had this year 7 class, and they all got very good at their routines. Several years later they came back in year 10 and they still were very good at their routines, and so you spend less time developing those approaches. So I think that we need to make sure that we give time for that, be really consistent, and also allow those routines to develop. I think that quite often, in my experience working with young teachers, they try a particular routine and then all of a sudden, oh, it's not working, I'll try something new.
Yes.
And actually we need to really leave, I would say, a good 3 or 4 weeks to try and get a routine established. I mean, and I'm talking, with a secondary school teacher head on, so you'd probably be only seeing those young people maybe, 12 times in that 3 or 4 week period. And I think that you've got to give that time to embed those practices and those routines with the young people and help them to develop and really focus on the small wins that you have with those.
Yes. I think that's so valuable what you say about giving ourselves time to embed those routines. And if things are going wrong, wherever you are in the year, just stop. Okay, you're going to lose a lesson and you can't afford that lesson.
Absolutely.
But you can't afford to lose a bit of every lesson because you haven't dealt with it. It really is time well spent. And you can't expect yourself to teach difficult concepts, teach science, teach any subject and teach that behaviour. You really have just got to go, right, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
I just want to reassure you, if anyone's wondering what Becca meant when she mentioned scripts, we will be talking about those later on in the course, and you'll find they're a very, very useful.
Yes, and I noticed that there was a couple of other questions that came around about that sort of like that non-emotional response to a particular situation that you will crop up time and time again with young people, and we really do expose that with the use of scripts later
very
on. So it'd be useful if you have further questions about that and those scripts to bring those back to our next question and answer session.
Yes. And the other thing I liked was you saying about inexperienced teachers moving on too quickly because the strategy doesn't seem to work straight away. And I so empathise with that and that feeling of panic. And you find yourself veering and become quite inconsistent just because you're looking for the magic bullet. There isn't one. Take it from me, there's no magic bullet.
There's no magic bullet.
So, going on to question 5 then. This one's from Stephen, who would like some advice about writing class rules. So he's written, can you suggest some key approaches when posting a list of class rules, maxims or keywords, e.g. listen equals silent in a language class when you want them to be quiet during listening exercises? I'd like to know best practice in terms of visual classroom reinforcement of acceptable behaviours, please.
Okay, so I think that this is really about developing your expectations with the class, and actually it's not something to do alone. I think it is about working with that class, and again the ideal time is the beginning of the year as to what the roles and responsibilities. Now I wouldn't necessarily say rules, I would possibly say roles and responsibility within the classroom is, and what each individual wants to be getting out of it in there. And so that is something to develop with young people as part of getting to know them. Now, I do recognise that some schools and some settings have their very own sort of sets of rules, if you like, or codes of conduct that you have to work within. However, I do think to a certain extent a STEM classroom, and certainly a science lab, can be slightly different in that there's additional sets of rules, if you like, or expectations and responsibilities around health and safety, around managing practical equipment that you need to possibly have as a separate area of the lab for you to work with. And I think that it's about working with those young people to say, well, actually we do want to do practical work, and so we therefore are going to behave in this manner, or we want to all be safe. I think we've got to couch any expectations in really positive language in terms of, you know, what we want to do together as a class. I think that we should have not too many. I like 3s or 5s being maximum, preferably 3.
Absolutely.
And I think that there's a number of strategies that are raised in week 2 of this course that give some really good practice about where they should be displayed in the classroom, and how you should work with young people about them, and how you can use visual clues so that you don't have to get into the being broken record of put your goggles on, put your goggles on, put your goggles on, which you can sort of get into as a science teacher, that if you just can point at the sign for put your goggles on, that makes it easier for you. So I think that really it's about drawing the young people into developing their classroom expectations, trying to remain really positive around those with positive language, and really focusing on what's important for that class and those young people and the way in which they wish to work. I think that's what I would say. And I must say that the sort of strategies in week 2 are really fantastic, much better than I would go and look at those if I was struggling with this area.
I really like that you emphasise that you're doing them with the students, you're not doing them to the students. I think there was a teacher on the last time this course ran who had multiple classes, and she had to go from class to class, and she said she actually had like a little display board that she displayed with the rules on, but it actually flipped over, so there were very similar rules, but it was slightly different for each class, so the children or students had real ownership of them. So
absolutely. I think it is really important that there is certain level of ownership from those young people, that they can see where they have come from and how they're working towards them, and also I think as well what their expectation is of you as a teacher, because I think to a certain extent it is about developing that relationship with those young people, and so there's expectations from you, but also expectations from them to you, and I think that we need to develop that relationship together.
Yes, and listening, it's not just you telling the students, it's you listening to what they want, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yes, and I love that you emphasise the phrasing it in positive language. And another thing, Stephen comments about how you want the young people to recognise that if you say listen, that means in a language lesson or in a science lesson where we've obviously got safety issues, that means silence while you listen. But if you've had that dialogue right at the beginning when you wrote the rules, you've packed a lot of meaning into quite short sentences because it means something to the children and it's relevant.
Yes.
So.
And I think that links back to the previous question really. It is worthwhile spending time to develop this, and time spent on these expectations and time to develop your routines and some consistent approaches across your classes. For a secondary teacher, to a certain extent, you do want to make your consistent routines quite similar across your classes, and also I think to a certain extent you've got to recognise the age of the students. So when they come in year 7 and they're 11 years old, they might have a certain different expectation around the science lab to when they are year 11 and 16 years old, and so you can say, well, you're raising the expectations of their performance at that level. And with year 7 students, it's really about possibly supporting them to develop the consistency in their routines and to understand what the expectations are. So about supporting and planning those students to be able to tidy up. What does tidy up mean to an 11-year-old? So the expectations of what tidying up means is different for an 11-year-old to a 16-year-old, and you've gone on a journey with them to a certain extent and given them more ownership and responsibility at that point.
That chimes, as an early years teacher, that chimes very much. I had to put a lot of effort into teaching my children exactly what I meant by tidying up. You see these toys on the floor, we're going to pick them up and put them in the box. That basic, and quite often. Yes. I like that you mentioned doing it, spending some time at the beginning of the year establishing these rules, but I think at any point you feel them drifting, it's just worth just stopping and spending 5 minutes just recapping.
And I think that there's a real there is an issue and a challenge for teachers if they come into an established class halfway through the year, or if they are not the usual teacher for that class. They might be, looking after the class because somebody's poorly and due to ill health, or have left. And I think that again, it's worthwhile spending that time, even at halfway through the year. With the pressure of work, sometimes we can not focus on that, but when establishing yourself, it's about introducing yourself to that class, asking them to introduce themselves to you, build that relationship with those young people, and also give them the expectations that you have in your classroom about the learning that's going to take place. And whether you're a new teacher to that classroom or a supply teacher who's coming in to support that class, I think that that's really important that you do both of those two things.
Yes, I think you devote that time and you create the best possible circumstances that the learning is going to, you're going to make good progress going forward.
Absolutely.
So.
Okay.
Yes, lovely. So
that was quite a long answer to that.
It was, wasn't it? I wasn't expecting that one to be, but there you go. So we're on to question 6 now, and this is Sylvia, who's had 5 likes, but also we've had very similar questions from Sian, Victoria and Lynn. And here we're asking about particularly vulnerable children. Sylvia writes, in the near future, I'll be working with disaffected teenagers who are under local authority care. Most of them have come from dysfunctional home backgrounds and have lacked consistency as they've moved from different foster homes. Please, can you give me some tips on how to reduce the likelihood of disruptive behaviour in their lessons and the best way to handle it should it arise?
Okay, I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm very fortunate that I've worked with a number of different vulnerable children. I think I would say that these young people are, and I think there's a link to several other of the questions around looked after children, or children with ADHD, or children who've got other particular issues from a troubled past. So I'll call those vulnerable children, vulnerable young people. I think part of what we as professionals, and again being the teacher in the classroom, is about bringing a level of consistency to their lives. I think that they usually have other adults who you can go to support you with the strategies to work with that young person. I think to a certain extent you might be able to develop some strategies if they are not ready to learn in the classroom, and I think that those adults around you in the school, whether that's a teaching assistant or a technician, can also help you with those strategies. So you can put in place a process where if that young person is not ready to learn or has had a bit of a traumatic overnight experience, that you can anticipate that and have a strategy to use with that young person to support them to be able to come at a different time and learn. I had a young man who was very challenged, and if he wasn't ready to learn, I would ask him to go to see the technicians to get me a kettle. And that was the code word for the technician to look after this young man, to support him for a period of time, because she had a great relationship with him, and she'd be able to support and get him to focus on something different, distract him from the mood that he was in, and then bring him back with the kettle, which we didn't really need, at an appropriate time in the lesson for him to be ready to come in and learn. I think with the rest of the young people in that class, if they're in a mainstream classroom, with the rest of the young people in the classroom, it sometimes feels a little bit unfair that somebody is being treated differently. And I think that it's worthwhile recognising with those young people that there are people have differences, that we're trying to all learn together, and sometimes some people are not ready to learn for things that are outside of the classroom environment, the challenges that they have, and so therefore again you're showing that you're in control of the situation as the teacher in the classroom, and that you have in place a strategy to make that a pre-planned strategy. I think that the most important side of this is that you actually have planned that strategy in advance, so that you know what is going to happen next. And that again links to the work on scripts. It's a response to a particular trigger, if you like, that you've got a plan in place for that.
Yes, no, I love that idea of being pre-planned, and obviously that's what Sylvia's doing as she formulates this question, and is thinking about it ahead of time. I love your story about your young man and the kettle, and I think what is so nice about it is completely face-saving. He can walk out of that room with his dignity intact. He's going to do an errand for you, and his needs are totally met without challenging him or giving him any more pressure than he needs in his life. So I really like that. I think that's a great idea. With younger children in an early years classroom, I used to sometimes send my children to play in the water tray because the playing with the water was just really relaxing, just completely on their own. You know, everyone else might be doing maths, but and like you say, the other children soon learn actually this person has different needs, you know, and obviously you wouldn't accept that they might be playing in the water tray just then, but for that person,
that was the right, that's the right thing to do.
And even at 4 years old, they can take that concept on board. So I'm sure older
children are very, they understand, I think, to a certain extent, that sometimes people, you know, are having a difficult day, and so and I think teenagers often have difficult days. And so if you recognise that and you're very in control of that in terms of being in the classroom, they recognise that they are being looked after by you, that the vulnerable young person is being looked after by you, but also you're looking after the rest of them. And
I think it's really nice of them to see, okay, I don't have these needs, but if I did, I would be treated respectfully, I wouldn't be humiliated. I think that does create such a nice atmosphere for everyone. So.
It does, yeah.
Okay. It will be hard work though, Sylvia, so
I think it isn't easy. No.
So we're moving on to a slightly different and challenging situation here, and Adamu, Debbie and Joanna all asked about this. Also Anita and Sian and other colleagues have all asked similar questions. So Adamu asks, what do you do next when students are showing challenging behaviours and you have put in your best to keep them under control and they still continue? Very trying. We feel for you, Adamu. And Debbie asks about dealing with students who have an answer for everything and a total disregard for rules. Yep, been there. And Joanna, what do you do with a persistently disruptive pupil? So this is exhausting, isn't it? When you've got this sort of situation.
And I think that this is about downright defiance, you know, whereas, you know, where they are just not going to do as you tell them to do. And again, I think that with these young people, the situation is that you need some support from other colleagues at this point, whether that be somebody who is local to you in the next door classroom or nearby, or a senior leadership team member, one of the head of science or head of department. But I think it's really important that you gain some support from colleagues for this, because it isn't acceptable that pupils are behaving in this way. I think it's about controlling yourself as the teacher, and looking at what was talked about in week 1, understanding your own reactions to that sort of situation, and trying to diffuse that, and being able to see that you are responding in a way. But it's challenging for you as an individual. If you have these young people, they can be not very nice. I think that moving forward from those bruising encounters, it's really important to think about identifying where that young person is having a positive experience within the school. Particularly in secondary schools, young people can behave very differently in different subjects, and talking to those teachers when they are being really positive in their class, and actually trying to maybe going and see how they are being really positive in that class. Quite often I would try, being a science teacher, to go and see them being really positive in another practical lesson. So quite often challenging young people can be really positive in sports lessons, another practical subject. And so you can go and see them with those teachers and try and see, focus on what is it that the teacher is doing with those young people that giving them a positive experience in that subject, and around that. Those young people seeing you have a good relationship with those teachers and talking to their teachers that they like and get on with and have positive experiences can also have an impact on those young people. I think it's about trying to make an effort to find a different sort of relationship with that young person, that's taken away from the heat of the classroom and the intensity of the learning environment. I think that's quite an important thing, to find something that young person can focus on, that you can talk to them about together. I think that's what I would say.
Yes, and I think, like you say, just finding different places, going into the playground, chatting about television programmes they watched, and building up a completely different relationship. I love your phrase, bruising, because it is bruising, isn't it? And being very aware of your own reactions and being kind to yourself, because it is hard and you will feel angry perhaps than you should do sometimes.
Yes.
They are a child or a young person, and you find yourself really, really angry.
And I think as you become more experienced as a teacher, you will, with younger, less experienced teachers, I think that you will have seen situations similarly before, and you build up your reservoir of different ways in which to respond to different young people. But realistically, we're all human beings, and there are some people, some young people and some adults, that we will never develop firm, positive relationships with. And I think at that point it's also worthwhile saying that, if at least they've got a positive relationship with somebody else in education, and I think that we use that to our benefits.
Yes, I think when we come to scripts, you will find those incredibly useful.
I agree.
So,
I agree.
Yes. So I think we've come to our last question, Becca.
Believe it or not, I think we have.
So, this is a Sylvia, again, a different Sylvia, and she asked a question that was also similar to one asked by Lynn and Alex. And Sylvia is not actually teaching at the moment. She said she worked as a teacher in 2 secondary schools for a short period of time, and her experience was emotionally so terrible because of managing behaviour problems that she decided to give up. She felt depressed, felt like she was a bad person, because she was not able to control the behaviour problems. But now, after some years, she's reconsidering the possibility of teaching again in a secondary school, but she's afraid of having the same problems. She feels she could be a really good teacher if only she could get over these issues. So,
this is a real, I feel for you, Sylvia. I mean, a lack of self-esteem. And we see a couple of other questions, people talking about this, in that they didn't feel confident within their own practice, and particularly within the issues around managing behaviour. And I think, there are a number of strategies that I think that you should take. I think that when we are moving back into teaching, or when we're managing a change in practice, we've got to think about the positives of it. The reflection grid's a really positive way forward, or a reflective journal is another opportunity to think about how you are feeling and the positive side of things, what challenges there are. I think for Sylvia herself, I would really suggest that she goes and looks at different schools and different contexts, because you might just have not come across a school that is a suitable one for you, in that you feel comfortable in. So I think observing in different schools, seeing how the teachers who are experienced and that have changed their practice and how they're working with young people will really help you, and then using a reflection grid to support you with that, or a reflective journal or something like that to help to support you with that. you will notice when you go into a school or that maintenance of a routine within the classroom and keeping that consistency, I keep coming back to consistency, keeping that consistent routine is really important. But also having a plan for others to help and mentor and support you. Somebody who's more experienced. We're very fortunate to, here in the UK that newly qualified teachers have their very own mentor for the first year of their teaching. And so that is really valuable to use that to help you to focus on the positives. I think it's really important to look at how other people manage behaviour in different types of classroom to build your own confidence as a teacher. And don't go and look at an experienced teacher you think it makes it look easy. Look at somebody who's similar to you in level of experience. I think that's really important because you'll be able to see, well, actually, they're making some of the same mistakes that I am, and you'll be able to develop your own confidence and your self-esteem and the way in which you work with each other. So I think for me, when we're talking about this confidence level of you as a teacher, it's about maintaining your routines, focusing on the positive changes that you're making in your classroom practice, having a plan to use others to support you, and then looking at different contexts or the same pupil that you teach in a different classroom and seeing how they are performing in that way. So I think that will help you to build and reflect on your practice. I think it's really important to do that. I think I've got everything there.
I think you have. I think that focusing on the positive, and if you have a reflective grid or a reflective journal, you have a rule with yourself. You write down what went well you're not allowed to have any targets until you've got at least 3 good things, and there will be some good things.
There will be.
Yes.
So good luck, Sylvia, because I think that if you feel that you can be a good teacher, it's about really focusing on that, using the support of other teachers around you to help you back into the classroom. I think we need great teachers in the classroom, so good luck.
Yes, and just remember that work of Carol Dweck. It's not just for children, it's for us. I can't control behaviour yet, I'm working on it. So, which is a lot more than some teachers are doing. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think that's us for this week, isn't it? So,
I think it is, yes. Yeah. I've absolutely enjoyed it. It's been great,
Jane. It's been
Jane.
Fascinating. Yes, I've loved reading all the questions. I've loved hearing your responses. So
that's great.
Back round about the 22nd or something like that, is it?
23rd of May,
23rd of May,
yes.
So
So please keep those questions coming. If there's something that you haven't had answered by us, please send them through. Thank you to all of those people who put those questions forward. We have tried to group them into the general areas that we were really seeing. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you later on in May.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.